Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching today. Last time we got together, we talked about God's providence, the way that God looks after us. And we talked a little bit about the notion of wanting some kind of a sign from God and our desire for the spectacular, to know that we're okay and God's in control and God is with us. But when we look for something spectacular, we're actually in danger of overlooking the genuinely miraculous nature of life and relationships. And there is sacredness all around us. The commonplace is sacred. So when the miraculous and the spectacular, when we think of those things or we want those things as some sort of a proof of God's presence, what we're actually doing is we're relegating God to the margins, and we ignore God in the everyday. So when we are no longer able to find a sign, we are actually at risk of losing our awareness of the divine in every day. So maybe what we need so much are not signs and wonders, but we need a willingness to nurture our own relationship with God and to have a connection with God that's more profound. So if we had a sign, some of us say, oh, if God would give me a sign of what to do, I would absolutely do it. Well, I'm not sure. Think about the Apostle Peter, for example. He had all kinds of signs. He followed Jesus along with the others for some 3 years. He saw miraculous events. He saw the feeding of the 5,000, the raising of the dead, the transfiguration, and yet when things got bad and Jesus was arrested, Peter denied knowing him, and he was not there in the end. So Peter had signs and he denied Jesus. So when we're looking for assurance of God's presence and when we're trying to discern what is the will of God for our lives, that has less to do with finding some event with all the earmarks of divinity and more to do with the transformation of our own spirits. It's about our relationship with God. So our goal ultimately, I think, would be to have this kind of effortless inner conversation with God on a regular basis. The problem is we are so good at talking to God and telling God everything that we want. It's almost like Santa Claus. We make a list and we say, this is what I want. But we're not very good at listening to God and hearing what God has to say to us. So maybe think of it this way. Try to listen to God like someone who is in love. And I know that sounds a little, I don't know, edgy or whatever, provocative, but if we listen to God as if we are in love with God, we listen to God like we would listen to our fiancé, for example. And there are a number of hymns and actually that relate to God in that intimate kind of way, like in the garden. I come to the garden alone when the dew is still fresh on the roses, and the joy we share when we tarry there. You know, God is not mentioned in that verse actually, but it's kind of imagery of maybe of a boyfriend and girlfriend in a garden, and they pay attention to each other. So it's possible to love God just like that and to desire God in a very profound way. And we can love God and express our love for God in a multitude of different ways. For example, think about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's in Jerusalem. It is probably the most holy of all Christian shrines. And it's located at the spot where traditionally Jesus was crucified and buried. And it is a microcosm of the different ways that we can love God. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the building, has approximately 36 different churches inside, beneath, and on top of the building. It's occupied by Catholics, Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Coptics, Armenians, Ethiopians, and several other groups. But relationships among those different groups of Christians are not always easy. And so a document was drawn up way back in 1852, and it's still in effect today. It's called the Status Quo of Holy Places, and it establishes what part of the building belongs to who, And the key to the building is not entrusted to Christians at all, but rather to a Muslim family who regularly locks and unlocks the building, and that same family still has the key to this day. So all those various groups of Christians who have access to that church love God deeply. They just love God in a variety of different ways. And I suppose ultimately God is less concerned with the style of our love for him and more concerned with the substance of our love and the fact that we actually do love the Lord. Unfortunately, we sometimes assume that we can have a relationship with God without putting the time and effort necessary into that relationship. We want intimacy without sacrifice, emotional highs without the lows. We want to get without giving. So we need to remember that when we love other people, we are expressing our love for God. But so often our relationship with God is like the Deus Ex Machina. That comes from Greek theater, and it literally means God from a machine. And back in the era of the heyday of Greek theatrical performances, there was actually a machine, a crane, that was used to lower an actor who would play a god or a group of actors playing a group of gods onto the stage. And the presence of this deity would often resolve difficult situations in the play. And our lives are kind of like that. We go along without much involvement from God. Then, in the midst of a crisis, we call for the Deus Ex Machina. We call for the crane to come in and be lowered so that God can fix everything for us. At the same time, we prefer to hold God at arm's length, so God is close enough to help us in time of a crisis, but far away so that we can avoid the sort of attachment that might otherwise influence the way that we live day to day. And yet, God is always there. We just need to pay attention. But it's hard in our culture to pay attention. There's so much out there for us to take in the way of information. What we do is more like sipping water from a fire hydrant rather than drinking deeply from a well. So we can begin to pay attention to God by finding a time in our day, in our daily routine, finding a time that allows for listening. At the same time, I know that's difficult to do. We're often interrupted by our cell phones or whatever, so you can do a couple of different things. You can put away the phone for a while and just focus on God, or you can be aware of natural opportunities for listening that life provides. For example, people rarely interrupt you when you're cleaning the commode or the bathroom, okay? So when you're doing that, pray. Listen to God. What I do is when I mow the yard, I use that as a time to meditate. It takes me about an hour and a half or so. My phone is inside the house. It's not with me and the lawnmower. So I plod along mindlessly, pushing the lawnmower around the yard, but I think in my head and I reflect and I ponder God's will for my life and I try to work on my relationship. So if this is something new for you and you haven't really made a tremendous effort at trying to allow space in your soul for the movement of God and space in your day to listen to what God might have to say, begin modestly, because our culture is increasingly unconscious. We just kind of go through life with blinders on. Things happen and we don't notice it. We miss a beautiful sunset because we're playing on our phone or whatever. So try to make reflection something that happens in an intentional way. Because of our unconscious world, reflection and holistic hearing is more difficult. But try to listen in a holistic manner. And by that, I mean, if you feel that God is speaking to you through the events that you see or through the way your own heart is touched, Listen to everything, not just the parts that sound good to you, because when we listen only to part of what God is saying to us, we actually distort the message of God and we stunt our own spiritual growth. If we mistake half of the truth for the entire truth, we're actually in danger of idolatry. So not everything God says to us is going to be sweet and joyful and wonderful. Sometimes God says very hard and difficult things to us. And many of us, quite frankly, do not need to know anything more about the will of God than what we already know. The reason I say that is we already know more about God's will than we're actually prepared to do. We know that God wants us to love the lowest and the least, but do we? We know that God wants us to cross over boundaries, to touch the untouchable, to love the unlovable, but do we? We know that God wants to organize our life in a particular way, to organize our finances in a particular way, but do we? We know plenty about God's will. We're just not willing to do it ourselves. We tend to live out our spirituality just in our heads, but we need to learn to live out our spirituality in our very lives, on our calendars, in our bank account, in everything that we do. So God's providence, to kind of wrap up this series of four parts, God's providence has to do with God's presence in the world, in the universe, God's presence and guidance in our life, and God's providence also has to do with our own openness to the movement of God within us, because God is not going to hit us on the head with reality and tell us what to do. God wants to be in a relationship with us, and God wants us to take the time to listen to us. So thank you very much for joining me this week, and we'll be back next week with another freshly posted video. Thank you.